It was a perfect Saturday afternoon in one of America's most exclusive neighborhoods. Rufus Gray had been floating peacefully in his stunning infinity pool, the sun reflecting off the crystal-clear water of his multi-million-dollar estate. The silence had been broken only by the gentle hum of the pool's filtration system and the distant sound of birds chirping in his perfectly manicured backyard. Then suddenly, bang! An aggressive pounding erupted at his front gate. Multiple angry voices started shouting threats. Rufus could barely make out what they were saying over the chaos, but one voice cut through louder than the rest. "We know you don't belong here. Come out now or we're calling the cops." Most people would have panicked. Most people would have hidden. But Rufus Gray wasn't most people. He calmly got out of his pool, water dripping from his swim shorts, and walked toward the commotion with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. His voice was steady, controlled, almost eerily calm as he responded through the gate. "This is my property. You need to leave." But that response only made the crowd angrier. What happened next shocked everyone to their core. The racial slurs started flying. These neighbors, these so-called upstanding citizens, began hurling accusations that he had stolen the house, that he was dealing drugs, demanding he show them proof that a black man could possibly own a mansion in their precious neighborhood. The situation reached a boiling point when someone in the crowd pulled out their phone and started recording, threatening to expose the truth about Rufus to the world. They thought they were about to humiliate him, destroy his reputation, maybe even get him arrested. But that's where this story took a turn that nobody saw coming. As the crowd continued their racist tirade, as phones were pointed at him like weapons, Rufus Gray pulled out his own phone with a smile that would have sent chills down anyone's spine. A smile that said he knew something they didn't. A smile that promised consequences they never could have imagined. He looked directly at the crowd and said 5 words that would change everything. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Before we dive into what happened next, hit that subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from, because this story is about to take you on a ride that will restore your faith in justice. What these neighbors were about to discover would not only destroy their lives, but expose a conspiracy of hatred that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Stay with me, because you need to hear how this all started, and more importantly, how it ends. To understand why that smile on Rufus Gray's face was so terrifying to those neighbors, you need to know exactly who they were dealing with. Because the man standing wet in his swim shorts being screamed at by a racist mob wasn't just any homeowner. He was Rufus Gray, a 42-year-old self-made tech CEO worth $150 million. But Rufus didn't start with money. He didn't inherit wealth or get handed opportunities on a silver platter. This man's story begins in the projects of Detroit, where he was raised by a single mother who struggled just to keep food on the table. While other kids were playing video games, young Rufus was studying by candlelight when the electricity got cut off, determined to build a different life for himself and his family. That determination paid off in ways that would make Hollywood writers jealous. Rufus earned a full scholarship to MIT, where he didn't just survive, he dominated. He graduated at the top of his engineering class, with professors calling him one of the most brilliant minds they'd ever taught. You'd think that kind of talent would open doors, right? Wrong. For years, Rufus faced the harsh reality that being brilliant while black in corporate America meant watching less qualified white colleagues get promoted over him, again and again. Every tech company he worked for found excuses to pass him over, despite his innovations making them millions. But here's what they didn't count on. Every rejection, every slight, every racist excuse was just fuel for what was coming next. At 28, Rufus made a decision that would change everything. He walked away from the corporate world that refused to value him and founded his own AI security company in his garage. While his former colleagues were climbing corporate ladders, Rufus was building an empire. Today, that garage startup employs 800 people and holds contracts with Fortune 500 companies across the globe. But here's what makes Rufus truly dangerous to people like those neighbors. He never forgot where he came from. Despite his massive wealth, he still drives his first BMW. the one he bought when his company finally turned a profit. Every Sunday, without fail, he visits his mother in that same Detroit neighborhood where his journey began. And quietly, without fanfare or publicity, he funds scholarship programs that have sent hundreds of kids from backgrounds like his to college. 6 months ago, Rufus decided it was time to give his family the life they deserved. He bought his dream house in Willowbrook Estates, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city, where old money families have lived for generations in their 99% white enclave. What Rufus didn't realize was that he was moving into enemy territory. The neighborhood was controlled by a homeowners association led by Rollins Blackwood, a retired judge who treated the HOA like his personal kingdom. From the moment Rufus's moving trucks arrived, the subtle warfare began. Suddenly, every minor infraction became a violation notice. His garbage cans were an inch too close to the street. His lawn wasn't cut to exact specifications. His delivery trucks were disturbing the peace. But it wasn't just official harassment. Rollins had neighbors conducting social media surveillance, documenting Rufus's every move, looking for any excuse to prove he didn't belong. The only allies Rufus found were Mei Yui, an Asian-American doctor, and Marco Juan, a Latino lawyer, the only other minorities brave enough to live in this hostile environment. The psychological warfare was taking its toll on Rufus's family. His wife Isabel was stressed beyond belief, constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid to even walk to their mailbox. Their 16-year-old daughter Zoe faced complete isolation at school, where the children of these same neighbors made sure she knew she wasn't welcome. But here's what none of those neighbors knew. Rufus Gray didn't just build a tech empire by being nice. He was a strategist, and he'd been quietly documenting everything for months. Every harassment incident, every violation notice, every whispered comment, all of it was being recorded and cataloged with the precision of a man who understood that information was power. The breaking point came when fake complaints started being filed with the city inspector, claiming safety violations that didn't exist, trying to force expensive repairs that could drive him out. That's when Rufus realized this wasn't just about him anymore. This was war. So on that Saturday afternoon, despite the mounting tension, despite knowing that every move was being watched, Rufus made a deliberate choice. He was going to relax by his pool, in his backyard, on his property, because he refused to be intimidated in his own home. That decision set in motion a chain of events that would expose the true face of American racism in ways that would shock the nation. It started when Karen Mitchell, a neighbor who'd made herself the unofficial patrol of the neighborhood, spotted Rufus by his pool and immediately made heated phone calls. Within minutes, Rollins Blackwood arrived with 5 other residents, marching to Rufus's gate like a lynch mob with smartphones instead of torches. Their initial approach was calculated, professional even. They claimed to have concerns about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. When Rufus calmly showed his ID and explained it was his home, that's when the mask came off. They demanded to see the deed, questioned how he really afforded the house, and made implications about drug money and criminal activity that would have been laughable if they weren't so disgusting. As multiple neighbors started filming and posting to social media, spinning their own narrative about the threatening black man, Karen Mitchell made the call that was supposed to end everything. She dialed 911 and reported an aggressive black male threatening residents. But what none of them realized was that Rufus was recording too. Every word, every accusation, every racist assumption was being captured while he stood there, appearing defeated, but actually gathering the evidence that would destroy them all. The police were coming, the neighbors were celebrating their victory, and social media was about to explode with their version of the story. They thought they had won. They had no idea that they had just walked into a trap set by one of the most strategic minds in American business, and that their lives were about to be turned upside down in ways they never saw coming. 4 police squad cars arrived at Rufus Gray's mansion within minutes, sirens wailing like this was a hostage situation, instead of a man relaxing by his own pool. A multimillionaire CEO standing in his swim shorts, water still dripping from his body, suddenly surrounded by 8 armed officers while his racist neighbors watched from behind the gate like they were getting front row seats to their favorite show. The officer dynamics told you everything you needed to know about the system. Young Officer Davis approached with genuine respect, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, while veteran Officer Hayes strutted in with the kind of bias that's been poisoning police departments for decades. Hayes looked at Rufus like he was already guilty of something, anything, just for existing in that neighborhood. What happened next was a masterclass in systemic humiliation. While those smug neighbors pressed against the gate recording everything, Rufus was interrogated like a criminal and demanded to prove he owned his own home. Think about that for a second. A man standing in his backyard, on his property, being forced to justify his right to exist there. Rufus, maintaining his strategic calm, pulled out his phone and provided everything they asked for. The deed, registration documents, tax records, bank statements, all displayed on his device with the efficiency of a man who'd prepared for this exact moment. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Rollins Blackwood, watching from the crowd, had the audacity to suggest that the documents could be fake. While Rufus stood there wet and cold, being treated like a suspect in his own backyard, the social media explosion was already beginning. The neighbors' carefully edited videos were going viral, with captions like, "Black man can't prove he owns mansion," and "Suspicious activity in exclusive neighborhood." The narrative was being written in real time, and it wasn't in Rufus's favor. This humiliation was calculated and deliberate. They made him stand there while officers spent 20 minutes verifying his story, calling banks, checking databases, treating a decorated CEO like a common criminal, while his tormentors celebrated their victory. Officer Davis was starting to see through the charade, quietly questioning why these neighbors were so invested in proving their fellow resident was somehow illegitimate. But Officer Hayes delivered the final insult. As the other officers confirmed that yes, Rufus Gray was indeed the legal owner of the property, Hayes pulled him aside with a warning that should chill every American to the bone. "Look, you might own this place legally, but you need to keep a low profile if you want to avoid future problems." Let that sink in. A police officer essentially told a law-abiding citizen to make himself invisible in his own neighborhood to appease racists. That warning wasn't protection. It was a threat wrapped in a uniform. But what Officer Hayes didn't understand was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because that warning, delivered to a man worth $150 million who'd built an empire by outthinking his enemies, wasn't intimidation. It was a declaration of war. The moment those squad cars pulled away and the neighbors returned to their homes, celebrating what they thought was their victory, Rufus Gray activated a network that would make their worst nightmares look like pleasant dreams. His first call wasn't to family or friends. It was to his legal team, the same attorneys who'd helped him build his empire and destroy corporate giants who'd tried to steal his innovations. While those neighbors were posting their edited videos and high-fiving each other, Rufus was assembling a team of private detectives, digital forensics experts, and civil rights attorneys who specialized in cases that made national headlines. If they wanted to play games, he was about to show them what a real player looked like. The investigation that followed was surgical in its precision. Every neighbor who'd participated in the harassment had their entire lives dissected. Social media accounts going back years were analyzed, revealing a treasure trove of racist posts, conspiracy theories, and hate speech that painted a picture of systematic prejudice that went far beyond one afternoon's confrontation. But the real bombshell came when they dug into Rollins Blackwood's background. The retired judge who'd positioned himself as the moral authority of the neighborhood had been running financial schemes that would make a mob accountant blush. Charity embezzlement, tax evasion, real estate fraud. The man was a walking crime syndicate hiding behind a judicial pension. The deeper they dug, the more sinister the picture became. This wasn't just about one racist neighborhood. It was about a systematic network designed to keep minorities out. Previous potential buyers who'd backed away from purchases suddenly made sense. Phone calls were made, stories were shared, and a pattern emerged of harassment, intimidation, and financial manipulation that had been going on for years. Mei Yui and Marco Wan, Rufus's only allies in the neighborhood, came forward with their own horror stories. Break-ins that were never investigated, HOA fines that violated their own bylaws, social isolation campaigns that had driven other minority families away. The conspiracy was bigger than anyone had imagined. But Rufus had been preparing for this moment longer than they knew. Those months of careful documentation weren't just about protecting himself. They were about building an airtight case. Recorded conversations, email chains between neighbors coordinating their harassment, HOA meeting minutes that revealed the conspiracy in black and white. It was all there. His legal team crafted a strategy that would pursue civil rights violations, harassment charges, and conspiracy prosecutions that could result in federal prison time. But Rufus had something else in mind. Something that would expose these people not just to legal consequences, but to the kind of public humiliation they'd tried to inflict on him. If you think this story is getting intense, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. And let me ask you this. What would you do if you were standing in Rufus's position right now? Let me know in the comments below. Rufus Gray was about to throw a party that would become the most talked about event in the neighborhood's history. An event that would bring together media, civil rights leaders, and city officials, with his racist neighbors as the unwitting guests of honor. They thought they'd humiliated him, but they were about to discover what real humiliation looked like when served by a master strategist who'd been planning their downfall from the very beginning. The trap was set, the evidence was compiled, and justice was about to be served on a silver platter at the most exclusive address in town. 2 weeks after that humiliating police incident, Rufus Gray did something that nobody saw coming. He sent out beautiful, professionally printed invitations to every single house in Willowbrook Estates. The invitation was for a neighborhood unity barbecue at his home, complete with catered food, live music, and what he called a special presentation about our community's future. The neighbors couldn't believe their luck. Here was their chance to corner Rufus on his own property, to make their demands clear and finally force him out of their exclusive enclave. Rollins Blackwood rallied the troops, telling everyone this was the perfect opportunity to show that people, they weren't welcome, no matter how much money they had. What those neighbors didn't know was that Rufus had installed a professional-grade security system throughout his property. Hidden cameras in every corner, audio recording devices disguised as decorative elements, and live streaming capabilities that would capture every word, every gesture, every racist comment in crystal-clear high definition. The day of the barbecue arrived, and one by one, the neighbors filed through Rufus's gate with the confidence of people who thought they were walking into their own victory celebration. Karen Mitchell came with a folder full of HOA violations she planned to present. Rollins Blackwood strutted in like he owned the place, ready to deliver his ultimatum. They expected to find Rufus cowering, maybe packing boxes, definitely ready to surrender. As they gathered on Rufus's immaculate lawn, expecting their private intimidation session, car after car began pulling up to the house. First came the local news crews, cameras rolling, reporters asking questions about the community meeting. Then came the civil rights lawyers, briefcases in hand, business cards ready. City council members stepped out of official vehicles, followed by representatives from the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and federal investigators who'd been watching this neighborhood for months. The neighbors' faces went from confident to confused to absolutely terrified as they realized they weren't the audience for this event. They were the main attraction. Rufus took the makeshift stage he'd erected in his backyard, looking every inch the CEO who'd built an empire from nothing. Behind him, massive screens flickered to life, and what appeared on those screens would haunt those neighbors for the rest of their lives. Years of private text messages between neighbors began scrolling across the displays. Messages that used racial slurs that can't be repeated here. Messages planning strategies to make minority families uncomfortable. messages celebrating when previous Black and Latino families had given up and moved away. Every disgusting thought they'd shared in private was now being broadcast to the entire community, recorded by local news, and live-streamed to thousands of viewers who'd heard about the event through social media. But the racist messages were just the appetizer. The main course was a forensic breakdown of Rollins Blackwood's financial crimes. Bank records showing money stolen from 3 different charity organizations. Tax documents revealing unreported income from real estate schemes. Email chains coordinating insurance fraud that had netted him hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. As Rollins watched his criminal empire exposed on giant screens in front of his neighbors, local media, and federal investigators, you could literally see the man aging in real time. His face went from red to white to green as he realized that his retirement wasn't going to be spent in his mansion, but likely in a federal prison cell. Then came the legal bombshell that sent shockwaves through the entire crowd. Rufus announced that a federal civil rights investigation had been underway for months, triggered by complaints from multiple minority families who'd faced harassment in the neighborhood. FBI agents were already building cases not just against the ringleaders, but against every neighbor who'd participated in the systematic campaign of racial intimidation. The screens lit up with legal documents showing pending charges: conspiracy to violate civil rights, housing discrimination, mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years were outlined in detail, along with financial penalties that would bankrupt entire families. But perhaps the most shocking moment came when neighbors who'd been silent throughout the harassment campaign began emerging from houses throughout the community. Mayui and Marco Juan were joined by other residents who'd been too afraid to speak up before, but now felt safe to stand with Rufus publicly. It turned out that many neighbors had been secretly documenting the harassment themselves, providing additional evidence that strengthened the federal case. Even some white neighbors, disgusted by the racist campaign they'd witnessed but been too cowardly to oppose, now stepped forward to support Rufus and distance themselves from the hate group that had been running their community like a terrorist cell. The media was having a field day. This wasn't just a story about neighborhood racism. It was a masterclass in how systematic oppression works in America's most exclusive communities. The footage of wealthy neighbors being exposed as criminals and racist conspirators was already being shared millions of times across social media platforms. As the presentation concluded, federal agents began making arrests right there on Rufus's lawn. Rollins Blackwood was led away in handcuffs while news cameras captured every humiliating step. Karen Mitchell and 3 other ringleaders followed, their mugshots destined to become symbols of how modern racism hides behind suburban respectability. The neighborhood unity barbecue had accomplished exactly what Rufus intended. It unified the community, just not in the way his enemies had expected. It brought them together in shared humiliation, legal jeopardy, and the certain knowledge that their reign of terror was over. But the most beautiful moment came as the last police car pulled away with its cargo of arrested racists. Rufus stood in his backyard, surrounded by supporters, media, and neighbors who finally felt free to be decent human beings. The pool where this entire saga had begun was now reflecting the faces of a community that had been purged of its poison, ready to heal and move forward. The man who'd been told to keep a low profile had instead chosen to shine the brightest light possible on the darkness that had been festering in America's suburbs. And in doing so, he'd proven that sometimes the best revenge isn't just success, it's using that success to make sure nobody else has to suffer what you suffered. The wheels of justice moved swiftly after that explosive barbecue. Within 48 hours, Rollins Blackwood was formally arrested on federal embezzlement charges, his decades of stealing from charity organizations finally catching up with him. The man who'd positioned himself as the moral authority of Willowbrook Estates was now facing 25 years in federal prison, his judicial pension seized to pay back the hundreds of thousands he'd stolen from programs designed to help underprivileged children. But Rollins's arrest was just the beginning of a legal avalanche that would reshape the entire community. Rufus's legal team had crafted lawsuits so airtight that settlements began flowing like water. The Homeowners Association, desperate to avoid a federal discrimination trial that would expose their systematic racism to the world, agreed to a $2.3 million settlement that would fund diversity programs and legal protections for future minority residents. Individual lawsuits against the neighbors who'd participated in the harassment campaign were equally successful. Karen Mitchell, the ringleader who'd made that fateful 911 call, saw her real estate career destroyed overnight when her brokerage firm fired her to avoid association with a federal discrimination case. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, and she faced personal bankruptcy from legal fees and settlement payments. The professional consequences rippled through the community like dominoes falling. A bank executive lost his position when his racist social media posts were linked to the case. A local business owner watched her family restaurant boycotted into closure when her participation in the harassment campaign became public knowledge. A retired police captain had his pension investigated when it was revealed he'd encouraged neighbors to file false police reports. But the most significant victory wasn't financial. It was systemic. The city, facing federal scrutiny and national media attention, implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination housing protections that became a model for communities across the country. Fair housing monitors were appointed, mandatory bias training was instituted for all city employees, and a zero-tolerance policy was established for housing discrimination complaints. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates was nothing short of miraculous. As the old guard faced legal consequences and public humiliation, they began fleeing the neighborhood like rats abandoning a sinking ship. For sale signs popped up on lawn after lawn, as racist families couldn't bear to live in a community where their hatred had been so thoroughly exposed and defeated. But nature abhors a vacuum, and new families quickly filled the empty houses. Young professionals of all backgrounds, drawn by the community's newfound reputation for diversity and inclusion, began moving in. The neighborhood that had been 99% white for generations suddenly became a vibrant, multicultural community where children of all colors played together in yards that had once been symbols of segregation. For Rufus's family, the victory was deeply personal. His wife Isabel, who'd spent months looking over her shoulder and questioning whether they belonged, finally felt free to plant the garden she'd always dreamed of. Their daughter Zoe, once isolated and alone at school, became one of the most popular students in her class, as new diverse families brought children who celebrated rather than ostracized her presence. The most beautiful symbol of their triumph came on a warm Sunday afternoon, exactly 1 year after that first confrontation by the pool. Rufus was once again floating in his infinity pool, but this time he wasn't alone. The crystal-clear water reflected the faces of children from across the neighborhood, kids of every background splashing and laughing together while their parents shared barbecue and conversation on his deck. Where once there had been racial slurs and threats, now there were birthday parties and block parties. Where there had been surveillance and suspicion, now there were carpools and community gardens. The pool that had been the site of such ugliness had become the centerpiece of something beautiful. A gathering place where the next generation was learning that diversity wasn't something to fear, but something to celebrate. As Rufus watched those children play, representing families from Mexico, China, Nigeria, India, and yes, even some white families who'd moved in after the racists left, he realized that his victory was complete. He hadn't just defeated his enemies, he'd transformed them into irrelevance. The neighborhood that had tried to reject him had become a place where rejection based on race was not just illegal, but unthinkable. The man who'd been told to keep a low profile had instead raised his profile so high that he'd become a symbol of resistance against suburban racism. His story had been featured in national magazines, his legal strategy had been studied in law schools, and his courage had inspired other minority families facing similar harassment to stand up and fight back. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Officer Hayes, the veteran cop who'd warned Rufus to avoid future problems, was quietly transferred to a desk job after an internal investigation revealed a pattern of biased policing. The system that had tried to silence Rufus had been forced to silence its own agents of oppression. As our story ends, Rufus Gray sits by his pool, not as a man who won a battle, but as someone who won a war. A war against the idea that success, wealth, and intelligence couldn't protect a black man from racism. A war against the notion that exclusive communities had the right to exclude based on skin color. A war against the system that told him to be quiet, be grateful, and avoid making waves. His victory proved something that every person facing discrimination needs to hear. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just living well. It's using your success to make sure others can live well too. Sometimes the best response to "you don't belong here" is to change here until it becomes a place where everyone belongs. The pool that started this entire saga continues to reflect the faces of a community transformed, where children who might have grown up as enemies instead grow up as friends. And in that reflection, we see the true power of refusing to accept injustice, of fighting back with intelligence and strategy, and of never, ever letting anyone tell you that you don't belong exactly where you choose to be. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply being exactly who you are, and refusing to let anyone convince you to be anything less. If this story of justice and transformation inspired you, smash that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear that racism doesn't always win.